Hello everyone, my name is Timur, and today I will be presenting along with Campbell Douglas on the origins of the Cold War. And in my presentation I will be focusing on the USA and USSR, specifically and how the Cold War evolved in the relationship between those two countries. We believe that when discussing the Cold War, we can't ignore the major role the confrontation between these countries played right after the World War II and how it affected the world order and realities that we know today. After the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union turned out to be the most powerful politically and economically. Each of them had a great influence on the world and sought every possible way to strengthen their leadership positions. In addition, the influence of the USSR has noticeably expanded to the countries of Asia and Eastern Europe, where the communist parties came to power. Based on this week's readings, we can see how the relationship between the two superpowers, the US and USSR, changed after the death of Roosevelt was more open-minded, if we can say so, in his approach to the cooperation between the two nations, while Truman, thanks to his Midwestern upbringing, was more narrow in his world outlook and has big distrust issue when it comes to the Soviets. This can be seen in a number of international meetings in which both Stalin and Truman participated. Interestingly, before this, on several occasions, and specifically at the Tehran and Yalta conferences, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill managed to find a common ground. At the same time, the following controversial issues arose regarding the post-world order: the process of creating an international organization to maintain peace and security, today UN, the fate of colonial possessions, the post-war situation in Germany and France, and the western borders of the USSR and other issues. The Allied heads of state and government met for the last time at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, as a result of which the following decisions were made on the post-war structure of Europe: restructuring of German political life on a democratic basis, securing zones of occupation for the Allies, recognition of the influence of the USSR in Central and Eastern Europe. Alarmed by the rapid rise in popularity of the Soviets, the Western world took decisive action. In 1946, in the American city of Fulton, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous speech, in which he directly accused the Soviet Union of aggressive expansion and called on the entire Anglo-Saxon world to resolutely rebuff it. Stalin was seeing how the Americans were backing away from agreements made at the Yalta-Potsdam Conference. To some extent, these events shaped Stalin's view of the Americans as potential rivals in international matters. At the same time, Stalin still hoped for cooperation between the West and the Soviets. However, his grave mistake was territorial claims against Iran and Turkey, which pushed both countries towards the Western Bloc. The relationship between the USSR with its former allies further worsened by the Truman Doctrine, which was aimed to contain communism, put forward in 1947. To sum it up, it offered the following: providing economic assistance to European powers, formation of a military political bloc led by the United States, the deployment of US military bases along the border with the Soviet Union, support for opposition forces in Eastern European countries, and use of nuclear weapons. Churchill's Fulton speech and the Truman's Doctrine were perceived by the Soviet governments as a threat and almost as a declaration of war. It seems that good outcomes with an atomic bomb testing emboldened Truman, who was considering the Soviets' support against the Japanese. But once his administration saw the potential of the atomic bomb against Japan, they suggested that the Soviets are no longer important to gain victory over Japan. They suggested the Soviets just were taken out of this deal. I'd like to note that the US dominance persisted until 1949, when the atomic bomb was invented in the USSR. From that time on, the arms race began, which was one of the main components of the Cold War. The turn toward a more confrontational US policy from 1946 to 1947, it appears, was simply a reaction to a series of increasingly aggressive Soviet actions. There was little that Washington could have done to appease Stalin's concerns. The confrontation between the countries was not conducted openly, but with the help of political, ideological, and economic levers of influence. Despite the fact that the confrontation between the two powers did not result in a real war, they still took part on opposite sides of the barricades in local military conflicts, which to some extent can be called proxy wars. The first hotspot of the Cold War was the Korean War, which started in 1950. It should be also noted that China supported the northern part, while the Soviets provided military assistance by sending their specialists and equipment as well as machinery. Peaceful settlement resulting from World War II divided the country into northern, pro-Soviet, and southern, pro-American halves. In conclusion, I'd like to briefly mention four distinct schools of thought which approach the origins of Cold War from different angles. The first school of thought, which emerged in the late 1940s and 1950s, placed responsibility for the Cold War on the Soviet Union. Beginning in the late 1950s and following the Vietnam War, so-called revisionist scholars challenged this interpretation. They insisted that Washington, not Moscow, was the guilty party. The third school of thought combined elements of the first two interpretations. Post-revisionist historians acknowledged that the United States had made errors, but they saw the Cold War mostly as a tragic inevitability. With the brief opening of the Soviet archives after the Cold War, the fourth school of thought emerged and placed greater culpability on the Soviets in general and Stalin in particular. And finally, when looking at the origins of the Cold War from today's perspective, it can be said that both parties were equally guilty. The Americans and the Soviets have made every effort to establish a bipolar world, and this is how the whole situation evolved. And before I give floor to Campbell, I'd like to pose two questions to the following presentation. First, do you believe if Roosevelt's approach to the Soviet Union was preserved by Truman, the Cold War would never happen? And second, from readings of this week, findings of which school of thought you think are closer to the truth. Thank you for your attention.
As Temer said, any discussion of the Cold War in China must necessarily involve a discussion of the American-Soviet relationship. So in this section, I'll discuss the different strategies that the two powers adopted in China, both pre and post 1945, and the effect that this had on politics and the eventual revolution in China. The distinction between pre and post 1945 is kind of arbitrary, but I'm just going to go with that because that provides kind of a helpful division. In the early 1940s, Chinese diplomatic relations were complicated by the ongoing competition between the GMD and the CCP. While Chiang Kai-shek's GMD held more power and influence, there were some critical internal issues within the regime that made further conflict seem inevitable. Up until 1945, the relative dominance of the GMD, paired with the strong interest the Allied powers had in preventing civil war, led to the Soviet Union taking a more laissez-faire approach. Although they attempted to maintain some of their strategic interests, it appears Stalin believed that the CCP was neither strong enough nor closely aligned ideologically enough with the Soviet Union to support a more radical bid for power. These are some of the reasons that the USSR did not take the initiative in China in the first half of this decade, instead choosing to cooperate more with the Americans in signing an agreement of friendship with the GMD. So generally the Soviets were unwilling to commit openly to the CCP, making it clear that they were not to operate openly in Soviet-occupied territories, and even threatening to drive them out of Shenyang with tanks in 1945 if they did not vacate the city. This relates somewhat to the Sino-Japanese War, in that it was in the interest of both the USSR and the United States to maintain a united China, at least while the war was going on, in order to ensure the ultimate defeat of the Japanese. Similarly to the USSR, one of the goals of the American strategy in China during this time focused on maintaining peace between the GMD and CCP, because the US saw them as being critical both to their success against Japan and to maintaining stability and influence in the region. In many ways, there were reasons for the West to feel optimistic about China's political future. The fact that the USSR remained relatively cooperative meant that the CCP had little hope of achieving success in any type of aggressive revolution. They mostly had to rely on political maneuverings, and if they hoped to gain any sort of power. This being said, the Soviet-American alliance also gave them some degree of protection from the GMD, as, again, the primary goal of this partnership was to preserve peace. The result was that until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1946, both sides did attempt to come to some sort of agreement through negotiation. The second half of this decade began with the defeat of Japan, which ultimately meant the GMD and CCP had to either agree to form a joint government or fight for political control of the nation. This occurred around the same time that the Americans began pressuring Chiang to cooperate less with the Soviets. The result that was both increased tension between the GMD and both the USSR and CCP. Ultimately, the Soviet Union supported the CCP's attempt to assert control over Manchuria, which were the actions that, in some ways, led to the eventual Civil War. With the defeat of Japan, the US took a more aggressive approach in China, pressuring Chiang Kai-shek to cooperate less with the USSR. American influence in China rested almost completely on the continued power and influence of the GMD. But it became clear through 1946 and 1947 that the CCP was beginning to gain an advantage in the Civil War. It seems that the underlying attitude of many American leaders was that Chiang was not really a great ally. He was kind of uncooperative at times, and some believed that the ultimate goal should be for the United States to disengage from the nation. This resulted in a half-hearted policy of continuing to fund Chiang's GMD while not providing other more meaningful forms of support. This meant that the Civil War was prolonged, but it did not keep the CCP from eventually securing political control of the nation and almost completely eliminating the GMD. In many ways, the Soviet and American policies in 1940s China provides insight into the changing attitudes and policies that eventually morphed into the Cold War. In this situation, one can see the attempts at cooperation with the goal of peace while still attempting to advance their respective ideologies. Even though the CCP eventually took power, neither the USSR nor the US really achieved long-term influence in China. One could say, on a surface level, the CCP is communist, Soviets were communist, doesn't that indicate that the Soviets achieved victory? But this doesn't really take into account the harm that was done by the Soviets' reluctance at times to put their full support behind the CCP. And even on an interpersonal level, one could argue that Mao never really quote-unquote forgave Stalin. Although this falls outside the scope of this presentation, it is important to note that there was significant disintegration of the Chinese-Soviet relationship under Khrushchev later on. So I hope this presentation was helpful and that it gave you more of an understanding of how the Chinese Civil War and the competition between the GMD and the CCP in China influenced and offers some insight into the Cold War. Thank you very much.